Hi, and welcome to this episode of Think About It. Today's episode is devoted to a writer that is maybe not as familiar as others on this list, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, or Bamewawagezhikaquay, was born in 1800 in today's Michigan. She's the first known published American Indian literary writer, the first known Indian woman writer, the first known Indian poet, and the first known poet to write poems in the Native American language in works that have been published. I spoke to Robert Dale Parker, a professor at the University of Illinois, who's done amazing work in assembling Schoolcraft's writings into a book and to also gather many of the formerly lost writings by Native American poets. Schoolcraft's status as the first American Indian poet, or Native American poet, depending on the language you use, is of course an ambivalent distinction. As Professor Parker points out, it marks all of those voices that are lost, forgotten, or that we have been taught not to remember. There's of course a vibrant tradition of Native American poetry today, and Schoolcraft is an important figure for everyone who's interested in literature. We're releasing this episode during the week when many Americans celebrate Thanksgiving, and 13 states in the Union already celebrate Indigenous Peoples' Day, to mark also the status of Native American culture and writing in our national canon. I hope you'll enjoy this episode of Poetry and Writings by Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. Think About It. Deep conversations with Willy Baer on big ideas and great books. I'm delighted to welcome someone very special today. So Professor Robert Dale Parker of the University of Illinois. Thank you, Bob, for being here today on the Think About It podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
So you are a professor of English, the Frank Hodgins Professor of English. You've published books on critical theory. The fourth edition of your How to Interpret Literature just came out with Oxford. Congratulations.
Thanks.
And I know you, and I have you on the show today to really talk about and celebrate a poet who is maybe not as known to so many people. So this is a woman who was born in 1800 with the name Bamewawagezhikaquay, or Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who you really introduced me to. And I'll just start us out with something you write in the book you edited of her writings called The Sound the Stars Make Rushing Through the Sky, which is right here, which is her name, actually in English translation of her name. And then Changing is Not Vanishing, a collection of American Indian poetry, where you write that Jane Johnston Schoolcraft is the first known American Indian literary writer, the first known Indian woman writer, the first known Indian poet, the first known American Indian to write our traditional stories, and the first known poet to write poems in an American Indian language. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 firsts. And then you took the time to edit her work. Can you say how you discovered her poetry? And then I would love to talk about some of the poems, which are just moving and an incredible discovery. They were an incredible discovery for me.
Sure. As you know well, the word first is loaded, right? So I like to think of it, as I think you do, as a signifier of the things we don't have. The thing we tend to think of history as what we remember, but history is more what we forget. We forget more than we remember. So each time I mention those things that we might think of Schoolcraft of as the first this or the first that, I hope that that tells people there were probably others and we've lost them. Maybe we'll find some of them. Maybe we are finding some of them right now. And I hope that the Schoolcraft Project encourages people to take up that task. And people are working on that. But it also is a tool to call attention to, the claim for first is a tool to call attention to things that we have been taught to forget, and to remind ourselves to open our imagination to the possibility of writers who we have been told never existed, or we've been told didn't matter, or we've been told only are there for some kind of token historicist reason that doesn't really address the aesthetics of what they did. I love the history, and it's part of the aesthetics, and I want to bring those together. I want us to do, as you said, to be able to see these writings as something that are distinctive in their own way, and that also signify much more than themselves.
And you say also in the anthology you edited of American Indian poetry, that by definition, poets are not representative. So Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, we're not talking about her here as representing anything but herself and her own accomplishment and her own achievement. And if we can just go right in to imagine a young woman in what's today Michigan, if you can say a little bit about how she comes, and it's just such a remarkable story on its own merits, without doing all those first, the sequence of, as you said, the first, which was always testament to those who didn't get published, didn't get remembered, and are lost.
So I want to see her as representative of herself in something specific, and I also want to see her as representative of more. I want to have it paradoxically both ways, because I think that's the way it works. Her story, she was born, as you said, she was born in 1800, and she came from a remarkable family that represents something that a lot of the conquering culture's memory has lost. A family from the Métis world that was both red and white, not red or white, not back and forth between red and white necessarily, but a culture that our memory, so many of our memories have not envisioned, where it was ordinary to be what we awkwardly call, and I think distortingly call, bicultural. It was a red and it was a white world, and that was a distinct culture, the Métis culture. It's more active now in Canada than it is in the north central US, but it's still there. And she lived very much in the Ojibwe world of her mother, Ozhaguscodaywayquay, and her Scotch-Irish born father, who came to what's now Canada and the United States as a fur and took up the fur trade. And I can tell more about that story later if you want, but to keep it brief now, they married in 1790 in what's now northern Wisconsin, in La Pointe, or Chequamegon as they call it, and then moved east to Sault Ste. Marie in the northernmost part of what is now Michigan in the Upper Peninsula. And he, drawing on her skills, her knowledge, her kinship, her connections, built a prosperous fur trading company and raised their children, 8 children, raised their children in the culture and language of the Ojibwe world and the culture and language of the English-speaking world. And he, John Johnston, was a reader. So in this place that was to the whites, the middle of nowhere, he collected a massive library when books were rare and expensive, especially away from the cities, and raised his children with, I would think, this is a crude analogy, but I like to think of it this way, that she had the rough equivalent of what today we would call a master's in English literature.
Really?
Growing up reading in that library. And she grew up in the world also speaking French. The only white people who were there besides her family spoke French, and so did many of the native people. She probably almost never saw, except when she traveled away from Sault Ste. Marie, almost never saw a white woman, and certainly not an English-speaking white, or even more less likely an English-speaking white woman. And so grew up in French, but primarily in Ojibwe and English, speaking English pretty much only in the family. And when there was another English speaker passing through, usually a fur trader or somebody connected to a fur trader, and provides us something that I don't know of another writer leaving, though there must have been many. There were many, especially there were many children growing up in this world where they had frequently a fur trader father and an Ojibwe mother, or grew up among the children of similar marriages. But she had this unusual education, and she wrote poetry. Her father wrote poetry, not very well, but he wrote poetry, she wrote poetry. She was probably the darling of her father. There's some indications of that. And then she married this guy, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, who is a whole story in himself, who was already famous, though I'd like to hope that this project of recovering Jane Johnston Schoolcraft can make her Schoolcraft, so he can be Henry. And he gave her access to the wider English-speaking literary world. And he often, well, he has a whole story. We can go to that if you want, but he recorded a lot of her writings. He copied them out by hand, and he was a saver, and he saved his manuscripts. And so those manuscripts, many of them we can get. And so finding those manuscripts, well, when I first saw them, I was in the basement of the University of Illinois Library. I'd gotten some microfilm from Henry's papers from the Library of Congress on the hunch that there would be more writings in there by Jane Johnston Schoolcraft than anybody knew existed, or that anybody who was publishing knew existed.
So his writings had been collected, and I like the fact he features in the your introduction to her book, but he is the one who allows us to see it today because he transcribed some things. But his papers were preserved because he's a very important person as a white administrator of Indian Territory, and then he ultimately leaves the federal government, and then he takes it upon himself to record all these stories and all these poems, but many of them are his wife's original writings.
That's right. Right. He was a government official responsible for administering the U.S. authority over what was called the Michigan Territory, which was bigger than the United Kingdom, and with slow patterns of transportation. So this was a big job.
Yeah.
And where were we? Oh yeah, so there I was in the basement of the University of Illinois Library. I get this microfilm, I reel it up, I open it up, I spin it around until I suddenly see these poems, and I want to grab everybody in the library and say, look at this, and scream and yell. And of course you can't do that at the library, so I did it in my own head. And that began a long journey of contacting every library I could that I thought might have anything. They usually didn't. And gathering all the writings of hers that I could find, and then editing them. And I tried to do a really expansive job of editing them. I didn't just want to do a casual transcription and dump them out, as I was afraid somebody might do, because I thought that they deserved the full editorial treatment that the most famous writers get, and a full-scale, heavily researched, not just a biography. I thought of what I did as a cultural biography, so that it told a story not just of she did this and then she did that, but of the world that she lived in and that made her, but that she now gives us a point of access to that we have so often lost.
And you're saying it's its own culture. It's not a bicultural space. It's actually its own distinct culture. And I think you give a really great presentation of a culture that's unfamiliar to a lot of people, I think. A lot of people, of course, there are many people in America who are fully aware of this culture, but there are also many people, and to just reference something you said in the beginning, that we've also been taught to forget that there is no such history or story. I have a collection, like many people, of Norton anthologies of editions from over the years, and you could not find a Native American poet for a long time. Now, thanks to your work, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft is in the Norton anthology, the Heath anthology. She's actually anthologized now.
Right.
But you're discovering, to your sense of discovery in the library of the University of Illinois, it's a bit, and you make this analogy, it's a cautious analogy, it's a bit like people discovering Dickinson's poems when they knew they had 8 poems during her lifetime, and suddenly they realized there's 1,700 poems, and she's maybe the greatest poet America ever produced. But in her lifetime, hardly anyone knew anything about her. So when you have the sense of discovery, how did you realize these are her poems in the midst of her husband's papers?
Oh, that's a good question. And I wish there were one button to press that would give a full answer. It's not quite that simple, but the closest thing is if something is in her handwriting, but you have to be really careful about that, because she didn't have a photocopier, she didn't have a scanner, she didn't have a camera. So if she wanted to keep a copy of somebody else's writing, she would copy it out in her own hand. Yeah. So you have to really check it and be careful and look at the context and maybe look at the multiple drafts with revisions. And maybe sometimes the poems are in letters, or other people are in their letters attributing something to her writing, or in this cache of manuscripts that Henry generated that I think even the literary historians who are now looking at this and starting to pay attention to this cache of manuscripts, I think often are not quite processing. So he loved to write things out by hand. And he left, I'm going to guess, about 50,000 pages of handwritten documents. Now, maybe that's a little distorting, 50,000 pages, including documents sent him. So let's say 25,000 pages. No, 25,000 documents. So maybe 50,000 pages all over again, or maybe more than that, because some of them are really long. But in any case, he's writing all the time. He probably didn't sleep much. And when you read the stories of his hand paralyzing, I think he probably had carpal tunnel. So he's writing all the time. And he's in Sault Ste. Marie in the winter, which is 5 or 6 months long, where the snow gets taller than the people, deeper than the people are tall. You need a way to pass the winter. So traditionally, storytelling was one way. And his white person's analog was to make a magazine, but he didn't have a printing press. So they wrote it out by hand, and he loved doing this. And many of his documents that he wrote, even though some of them are phonetically written and maybe his hand is paralyzing and you can hardly read them, he has a different handwriting for every kind of occasion. So sometimes he would write out the words as if they were set type, sort of calligraphically. He would make them look like they were printed. So he had every extreme, from almost illegible to hyperlegible. So, but he did, in the winter of 1826 and 1827, he did this magazine through a series of issues, most of it his own writing, but sometimes writing from other people around him, and a lot of writing from Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. And so there are a number of poems and stories by her there, and they're always in some coy way attributed to her in one of the pseudonyms that he would playfully give her or that she would playfully take. And so you can tell that, and a lot of people read these things now. We have them accessible now, and they want to make her into a 21st century writer. So they describe this magazine, in many ways a really colonialist magazine, mostly with Henry's writings, which are often really colonialist. They describe this magazine as edited by Jane and Henry. There is absolutely not one shred of evidence in the records that she edited or thought of herself as an editor, but that's what people want to see. So almost every time I read people writing about this, they say that. And I think it's much more interesting to take ourselves out of what we want for the 21st century and imagine and try and imagine. I don't think we can succeed, but we can try to imagine what that world was like, where it would have been almost inconceivable for her to think of herself as an editor, and where this is still somehow a collaborative project, but they're not in the same space. And so he is providing this venue for her writing while he's also stealing land from her people and screwing up her family's finances and sometimes condescending to her. And it's a much more complicated picture than the boilerplate projections we would have of our own more feminist world onto a world from 200 years earlier.
And I think the wish that people have is that we want to find this voice as a form of self-expression.
Yes.
According to the parameters we have today of self-determination, of identity, that's somewhat, that you choose what identifier is the most paramount or most important one. And as you said, she probably has many, what today we may call intersectional or something like that. Ojibwe, French, English, married to him, speaks with her family and her children in native language, writes poems, transcribes them. So she's in a space that we would like her to be a bit more stable maybe, and we can sort of pull her out. But when we stay there, what her poems, and I was really struck by the poems that I think they're very readable for us today. I think partly maybe because I was trained reading romantic poetry, they clearly have a kind of romantic dimension, which is for us sort of heightened self-expression and this heightened intense relation to the landscape. And and I always thought one of your favorite poems is the one about seeing the pines upon returning to a native country. And in your book, it seemed to me, and it's hard to say what another, I think that's one of them you really, really liked. And
Yes.
I like the contrast a lot, and I like the Willy poems, which I want to talk about. But if we talk about the poems you really were struck by, not just as a literary sleuth and historian, but you were struck by as a person, as a reader.
Yeah, there are lots of them. Why don't we start, since you mentioned To the Pine Tree, why don't we start with that?
Yeah.
And this is part of what makes that a good place to begin, would be that, well, I'll tell two stories. Story number one, as I was doing this research, I plugged her name into WorldCat, which is now easily accessible. People know about it, scholars know about it, not so much then. And of all things, 7 days before, somebody had, a librarian, had put into WorldCat a manuscript of her poems in, of all places in the world, Springfield, Illinois. So that's an hour's drive, or a little more than an hour and a half, maybe, drive from where I am. I would have gone anywhere in the world for this. And there it was. And how it got there, I can only speculate, but there's no record of how it got there. An hour and a half away. And wonderful story, because they have, if you happen to remember, I don't know if you would, but maybe some listeners might, back in 2007 or 8, when Senator from Illinois, a guy named Barack Obama, declared that he was going to run for the presidency, he stood in front of what had been the old state house of the state of Illinois. And in the basement of that building was the library of the state of Illinois, and that's where it was. It's since been removed. They built an Abraham Lincoln Museum, and they moved the library materials into the Abraham Lincoln Museum. And as they were about to move, the librarian said, what are we going to do with these boxes that nobody's opened and nobody knows how long? Well, why don't we open that stuff up and see what's in there? And if it's books or something or whatever, we'll catalog it. So that's how they found the manuscript. It had been sitting there for maybe over 100 years. It had been in the library, I forget the date right now, but I was able to date it by the book plate, which was from the Secretary of State, who was the honorary librarian. It was 1883 or something like that. And I can only guess that they got it when, after Henry died, his wife sold his papers, auctioned off his papers. But it was a manuscript where Henry had copied out a full book of Jane's poems, and he opened it with To the Pine Tree. And so to him, it seemed like the introductory poem, which is why I begin with it in the book. And in one of Henry's manuscripts, he tells the story behind the poem. And the story is that when Jane, a story within a story here, I won't give it all for now, but when her father took her to Ireland and England in 1809 and 1810, and she had a miserable time, and she couldn't wait to get back. And so he finally took her back after she was away for about 6 months. And she wanted to get home. She wanted to see her mother. She wanted to see the land that she identified as her land. And as they're coming down the St. Lawrence River back from England at that point, finally she sees a pine tree. And that's what tells her she's home. That's the marker of home from her long travels. And when she tells this story to Henry, according to Henry, he says, why don't you write a poem about that? And so she does, but she writes it in Ojibwe. And one of the poems that we have from her in Ojibwe is a prayer. The other two are about her intense association with that native land, and Inukian and Ojibwe. So I'll read, but she translates it into English. I think your listeners might like to hear it. And probably most of your listeners know this, but when she says Erin, E-R-I-N, that's referring to Ireland, because she's coming back from England and Ireland. So here's how it goes, 3 stanzas. The pine, I eager cried. The pine, my father, see it stand, as first that cherished tree I spied, returning to my native land. The pine, oh, lovely scene, the pine that is forever green. Ah, beauteous tree, a happy sight that greets me on my native strand and hails me with a friend's delight to my own dear bright motherland. Oh, 'tis to me a heart-sweet scene, the pine that's evergreen. Not all the trees of England bright, not Erin's lawns of green and light are half so sweet to memory's eye as this dear type of northern sky. Oh, 'tis to me a heart-sweet scene, the pine, that evergreen. I love the way she just takes it and has to say it over and over again so that it represents what everything that motivates the poem and that motivates her sense of connection to who she is and who she comes from.
And I love how it opens up another dimension of America, that we have, of course, an effort in American literature, everybody trying to set themselves apart, trying to invent their own tradition. The entire canon is preoccupied with not being derivative of England. And she writes the third stanza, not all the trees of England bright, not Erin's lawns of green and light, are half so sweet to memory's eye as this dear type of northern sky, which you would think Michigan could plaster over its current state house, or Illinois could plaster over its current state house and say, this is who we are. That she actually is one of the guiding spirits of America. But as you also said, she had not been anthologized, it wasn't known, and she didn't express what America means, which is America, as you said, her husband was the one who basically forced her people into kind of treaties that deprived them of all their land. So she's returning to a land and feels at home, being in the situation where what is happening at this moment, that people are being driven off their land or expropriated, right?
It's a vexed history in lots of ways. So she and Henry first, well, he comes with the federal, as the, excuse me, as the official representative of the federal government in 1822. But he was there 2 years before with an expedition where the US was going to check out the territory to see what they might be able to grab and how. So in 1820, he's the sort of lower level official on that expedition, and led by Lewis Cass, who was later governor of Michigan and a presidential candidate and Secretary of War, and a sponsor for Henry. And they want to make a treaty. They've got troops, but there's just a few of them. It's a preliminary expedition. They want to make a treaty, and the local Ojibways don't want to do that. And there's a dramatic moment where one of the Ojibwe chiefs grabs the American flag and tramples on it, and things are really tense. And it looks like they're about to start to fight. And Jane's father is not around. He's off on some business trip. And Jane's mother, Ozhaguscodaywayquay, calls the Ojibwe leaders together to their house, to the Johnston house, and convinces them to sign this treaty. Jane was probably nearby, maybe in the room, maybe just outside, we don't know. And that's a double-edged legacy. So on the one hand, if they had fought, more troops would have come, and it would have been bad news for those Ojibways in that area, Sault Ste. Marie. On the other hand, they gave up something that meant everything to them. And so there's a vexed, and of course people remember this, so there's a vexed heritage there. She, in some ways, saved the land, and in some ways gave up the land. And I know this will surprise you, but the feds, after they signed this treaty, didn't live up to its provisions. That might be a big surprise. But they, for example, there was a burial ground there that they were supposed to respect, and they didn't. They built a fort right next to where the burial ground is. And this is just out the window from where Jane lived. So she could wake up every morning and look out that window, see the flag going up, hear the bugle playing to start the morning, and see where they were desecrating the burial ground, which has since been recovered and is now respectfully taken care of by the Ojibwe people in the area.
So what you're describing, Jane's mother's role, which you say to this day is very troubling for a lot of people, but she's in an impossible choice in some ways to say she should have done this or that. we know, of course, with the hindsight of history, what would have happened and what happened to so many other people who resisted.
She knew.
She knew, so she had information, and she basically made the decision to not bring the troops in and decimate her people, but instead to negotiate for peace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this poem is so, it starts your whole collection, and it's interesting, you put it at the beginning of the poem, which is also one of the, as you said, one of the few poems published in America in an American Indian language. And can you say something about that? Because you've, in addition to this work on Johnston Schoolcraft, you also edited a lot of other American Indian poetry. What does that mean, the status of that it's written in an American language that is not usually found in anthologies of American literature?
It means everything. When I did that broader anthology of early American Indian poetry, I expected I would find poems by other writers in native languages. They have to be there, but I didn't. So it means so many things in so many ways. For one thing, it took an act of imagination for her to come up with the idea to write out, to translate this concept of written poetry into a native language.
Mm-hmm.
We more typically see the reverse. We see native language materials not written as poetry converted into English language poetry. That's a whole interesting story in and of itself, but it's a central story because we have a whole movement of white poets who take oral or written texts that are not poetry in native languages, and usually with the help of native people translating, they turn those into what they call poems, and they call it American Indian poetry. And there are whole anthologies of quote unquote American Indian poetry that do not have a single poem written by an American Indian. There are all these white translations into the form of poetry, and some of them are very interesting and they're very good, but they're not Native American poetry. And they displace the possibility for so many people to imagine that there is a vast history of Native American poetry, which I've recovered in that other volume, Changing is Not Vanishing, which takes early American Indian poets to 1930. Yes, but I didn't find, I found other things. I found hymns, I found prayers, things that you could call poetry, songs and so on. But once you let in, and I'm perfectly okay with an expansive definition of poetry that includes all sorts of other genres, hymns and songs and prayers. But for this project, if you bring those into the tent of poetry, you'll not have any poetry left. And so I found over 140 poets before 1930. And I want most of them forgotten. As I was working on this project, I would talk to other scholars of American Indian literature, and I would have a little fun with this. I would say, well, can you think of poets before 1930? And they tended to get a little awkward and embarrassed because it hadn't dawned on them that they couldn't. Usually they'd come up, sometimes half the time they'd come up with one or two, and one very knowledgeable person came up with 3 or 4. But I found over 140. And again, a few of them were known to scholars. Alex Posey, most of all, was a wonderful poet. But sometimes John Rowland Ridge, who I know caught your
Yes.
Chequamegon, Yellowbird, John Rowland Ridge. So many times people have more than one version of their name, as Schoolcraft does. So there's the name in the Anglo name, and there's the name in their native language, and then there's the translation of the native language into English.
I want to stay with one thing you just said, really to underscore, you made it such an important point. And it took an act of imagination for her to transpose the idea of the written poem into her tradition rather than the other way around. Because it really struck me what you just said, because normally, to be frank, I would have just thought, well, they're Native American poets, and then they translate their culture expression into what we know as written poetry. And you said, no, she knew this other tradition very well, and she translated that into her tradition. But that was a kind of foundational or inaugural act.
Absolutely. And it means a great deal to many Native poets today, especially Ojibwe poets, to see this example. So was on the one hand disappointed not to find more examples from other poets, though I'm sure they're there. But also one reason they're not there is they didn't have access to what Schoolcraft did. They didn't have access to that model because the history buried it. So Henry Schoolcraft's papers, not this book of poems that was in Springfield, but Henry Schoolcraft's papers were known to some people, mainly to antiquarians. They looked to them for information about this or that, and this treaty, maybe not as much as they should have, but about this or that treaty, or about the history of federal administration of the Michigan Territory, or about even for biographies of Henry Schoolcraft. But they didn't realize that there was anything of much significance in Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. She was just background information. The little lady who wrote those silly little poems because of the condescension to women's writing. So if you go, her house is there today in Sault Ste. Marie. And if you go there, there's a historical plaque for her father. And it mentions that, oh, and his daughter married this famous guy, Henry Schoolcraft. And that's all it says about her. And if you go right next door where they put the house that Jane and Henry built, it had been down it was not there originally, but they moved it, I don't remember, a mile or so to where it is now. And they have the two houses next together. That also has this historical plaque. But it doesn't mention Jane at all. It mentions her mother, because she was a leading figure. It mentions they mentioned John Johnston, but her father, but she is not, or was not recognized. I think we're changing that now, but she was not recognized as a figure of note. And when you read these little antiquarian comments, and sometimes these antiquarians are wonderful, they do the heavy research and they dig into this stuff and they have the patience and the determination to do that research. But because of the filter of misogyny, they just thought she was a little bit of a background story and not of interest in herself.
There's two other poems that I was really struck by when I just read the book when I got it the first time. The one is, there's different versions of it called The Contrast, which explains which is her looking back at her childhood. And she says, with pen in hand, I shall contrast the present moments with the past.
Yeah.
Which is a very Wordsworthian or kind of romantic way of the poet looking back at her childhood. Usually it's a man, but it's not a man.
Yeah.
And contrasting that with her present state of mind and maybe not present conditions. And then the poem kind of splits in the middle, which says, but how changed is every scene, our little hamlet and the green, the long rich green where warriors played, and our easy elmwood shade. There's something that the poem registers, a change. So while you said in the beginning, she's part of one culture, she does have this poem that she calls The Contrast. And can you say something about this poem, which is really a kind of poem of becoming and loss? It's a beautiful poem, though. I think it's a really incredible sort of addition.
Absolutely. So let's think about this. There's two major versions, more than two manuscripts, but the first version is more Wordsworthian, as you said, more in that personal mode, where she's contrasting what she sees retrospectively as her idyllic childhood. There were complications as there are in any childhood, but afterwards you look back at it and you see it as idyllic. She contrasts her idyllic childhood with the torture she feels at the age of 23. And what is that torture? She's fallen in love. She's fallen in love with Henry. And we don't know what the details of the torture were, but it's a pretty representative thing. We all recognize that. And then she rewrites the poem a little later and she changes the ending. And now the contrast is no longer between the idyllic childhood and the torture of falling in love. Now the contrast is between the idyllic childhood and kind of being married to the United States.
So let's hear the first ending, which is the more Wordsworthian, and then the second one. You're right, the first one, if you give me the first few lines of the ending, then our listeners can hear the difference. One is he ends up in love, the other one may be in love with the Republic.
Sure, let me set this up a little before I read this. So I think the first ending is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm gonna set up a little about the second ending. And I think I already did, because I told you how she could look out her window and she could see the flag and hear the reveille in the morning from the fort that that housed the soldiers that were conquering her country. But she could also turn in the other direction and look into her own house and see that she was married to the official representative of the United States government that brought those soldiers there. And that governs the sense of torture she feels at the end of the second version. I'll read the first version and then I'll say a few about some of the words in the ending of the second version and then read that. Okay, so the first version ends like this.
But how soon the scene has changed, since I have in love's mazes ranged. Oft in tears I sigh and languish, forced to bear in silent anguish. Looks strange, expressions of unkind, without an intercourse of mind. Constrained to bear both heat and cold, now shunned, now prized above all gold. In converse now we take delight, oft joining in fair fancy's flight. Now elate, with pleasure smiling, kind is mutual, time beguiling. But how transient, oh, how soon
every bliss is turned to gloom. And even the lines end with an off rhyme, so that the neatness of the rhyme itself doesn't fit in as everything is falling apart. And then at the end of the other poem, she does some complicated things here. We have to remind ourselves, and I think people sometimes forget, that she didn't think about people, about concepts of race in the way that we might think about them in the 21st century. And she perfectly ordinarily, and I think we can understand this, absorbed some of what we would see today as the derogatory stereotypes. So she has phrases here like the warriors played, which seems to participate in the infantilizing of adult Native people, or the simple Indian. She's picking up that Wordsworthian, let's say, language, or that literary language in ways that might make us cringe. I think it should make us cringe today. And she mentions, just for context, she mentions the cot out of context. That might be a little hard to hear orally, so that just means the cottage. It's not a sleeping cot, it's just short for cottage. And she also talks about trade and lawsuits. So it's useful to remember that she's there because her father was a fur trader, and that the income that makes her life possible comes from fur trade. And she mentions, when she mentions lawsuits, her father, this is a separate story, but just to cut to the chase, her father was caught up in a lot of lawsuits against the federal government because they actually burned his house in the War of 1812 because he fought with the British. So that's what lawsuits, one of the things that lawsuits here refers to. Okay, so I'll pick it up at the parallel moment here in the middle of at the end of the second version. But how
changed is every scene, our little hamlet and the green, the long rich green where warriors played, and often breezy elmwood shade. How changed since full of strife and fear, the world hath sent its votaries here. The tree cut down, the cot removed, the cot the simple Indian loved. The busy strife of young and old, to gain one sordid bit of gold, by trade overdone, plethoric moil, and lawsuits, meetings, courts, and toil. Adieu to days of homebred ease, when many a rural care could please. We trim our sail anew to steer by shoals we never knew were here, and with the star flag raised on high, discover a new dominion nigh, and half in joy, half in fear,
welcome the proud republic here. I find that amazing. Half in joy and half in fear. She's living in multiple places and there's no language for it. She's trying to find one. And I think we all live in more than one place, but she did in a way that we can now see dramatically.
It's actually fast. It's an amazing poem to hear today and right now. And I just started reading President Obama, the memoir, Our Promised Land. I just started reading, and he opens it up by saying we need a strong dose of the imagination to settle the question whether our country is based on ideals we can realize or whether it's been betrayed and compromised from the get-go by the founding fathers, basically not allowing so many people to be equal. So when she says, and half in joy and half in fear, welcome the proud republic here, Obama says, this is our task. Not to be too crash, but I think for her, what you're saying, to say she's welcoming something, but it's yet to be realized even. It's not completely accomplished. So she's writing in this moment. She's 23 years old. She's married to this man who's administering, not directly, but responsible for the conquest of her own land. And can this new republic encompass or contain her? It's
and I think the answer is probably more no than yes, but
I don't know, Bob, because I feel kind of like more no than yes, but I'm kind of hopeful that part of what you try to do is in your book to bring it and to enter into the anthologies. I live in a world that you do live in a world of literature. She is now part of the canon of America.
She is not, or I hope so.
Right?
But it wasn't easy for her.
No, definitely not fair. And also what you actually described this, how the identification of Native American poets was often used to just exclude people. So when we may struggle with these kind of identities and there's different terminologies and people have every right to invent their own identities, you said for a long time that label was used just to keep people out of history and out of our textbooks.
Without even necessarily meaning to do that, that's what it did. When white, well-meaning poets appropriated the mantle of what Native poetry could be based on how they imagined it, they made it much harder for even the apparatus of publishing, the editors, the marketers, to envision the possibility of seeing and publishing and recognizing and distributing and publicizing the Native writers who were out there and who would have been out there in more numbers if there were more opportunities for those who were already there. Who knows that you've got a poet like, who knows that Lynn Riggs, who is somewhat known as a playwright, published an amazing book of poems in 1930. In an almost Wallace Stevens tradition, and nobody's reading that, or hardly anybody. I mean, a few of us, but it's.
But actually, it's because of your book that I went back to Lynn, who I'd never heard of, and I was trained at very fine schools, and somehow those schools managed to actually not teach me certain things. And I'm really interested in this. So actually, Lynn Riggs, I was actually going back to that poem and thinking, why is this not studied? And what we just talked about with Johnston Schoolcraft, the two different endings of the contrast of this poem. Between those two endings, something opens up between a personal, her love for her husband, this complex story, falling in love. You actually kind of outline a bit how complicated this marriage was, like many marriages. All marriages probably are complicated. And then the relationship to one's country, which is also complicated. And in these two poems, in a few lines, I want to talk, the poem, there's a couple other poems I really would love to touch upon, but the poem I was really moved by, and it's specific, it's to my ever beloved and lamented son, William Henry. So if you can say something about those poems for two reasons, because I find them very moving. They're about a child she lost, the child was very young, but there is a tradition of women writing about children and about the loss of children. It is not a tradition in poetry written by men, and which is a bit of an odd thing. You have probably big examples, counter examples, but let's just stay with the moment. What is her experience? And I love this poem personally. It's a very sweet poem, but not saccharine.
There's a beautiful recording of it by an Ojibwe singer.
Oh, really? Okay, I will look that up and put the link in the podcast. That's great. Okay.
Who was it nestled on my breast and on my cheek sweet kisses pressed, and in whose smile I felt so blessed? Sweet Willy, my boy.
A lot of it has to do with the intense feeling around a first child, also a child getting sick and dying in the same day so unexpectedly, and the tenor of that magazine, I didn't name it before, but it's called the Ozhaguscodaywayquay, which is Ojibwe for book, or the Literary Voyageur, which is a bit of a pun on the voyageurs who traveled with the fur traders. The tenor of that magazine changed when the little boy, age 2.5, died. And the community came together writing poems about the death of the boy. You can look at these poems in a couple opposite ways. You can say in a time when there was much more death of young children, people were more prepared for it in a sense. But you could also look at it in the opposite way, that they had more cause to be frightened of it because they knew it might happen at any moment. And so those two opposite directions, I think, help animate the sense of grief over the half expected and half unexpected loss at the same time.
But that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I know this kind of facile assumption, oh, childbirth was more common, so probably people were more used to it. And you're saying because it was more common, it was also much more terrifying. There's no qualitative or quantitative much more.
Exactly, no quantitative measure, but still, it's a way of expressing the challenge of that emotion. And so she writes another poem for him 8 years later when she goes back to her grave. And then she, in effect, relives him perhaps through the other children who, of course, are not going to relive him. They're going to be their own personalities the way anybody is. So we have a sequence of poems about children. And I think that's, again, so I think in the world that patronizes women's poetry, this is seen as a form of trivializing, a way to trivialize women's poetry. But for many readers, it works in just the opposite direction.
And I think what it does also, this opposite direction, it's a connection. It's so immediate, and yet so incommunicable that it's almost impossible to express. So the second poem you refer to is this Sweet Willy, which is the one that comes afterwards. Is that the one that she writes later?
Yes.
So if you could read the first stanza of that, it's very moving because it's actually written later than the actual moment of his death, right, of the child's passing.
Right. As the opening line tells us, it's called Sweet Willy, and the first stanza goes like this.
Sweet Willy, 100 moons and more have passed, since erst upon this day they bore thee from my anguished sight, and from my home away. And pensively they carried thee, and set the burial stone, and left thy father and myself forsaken and alone.
So the last stanza is twice as long as that short first stanza.
And I, that word is precious, as the apple of the eye, that looketh up to mansions, which are builded in the sky, that palleth with this scene of tears, and vanities, and strife, and seeketh for that better home, where truly there is life. I cling no more to life below, it hath no charm for me, yet strive to fill my duty here, while here below I be. And often comes the memory of my darling little boy, for he was sown in bitter tears, and
shall be reaped in joy.
I mean, I find this incredibly moving. And I wanted to ask you about the 4 lines, which are the second to last. I cling no more to life below. It hath no charm for me, yet strive to fill my duty here, while here below I be. So where is she located, and where does she feel she has to remain? When she says, which is a really strange shift, she's talking about her lost child and says, I cling no more to life below.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even want to live, but she says, yet strive to fill my duty here, while here below I be, which I think for anybody reading this, whether it's 1820, the 1820s or today, sort of thinking, this is 1827, I think it's after 1827, right? 8 years after. Correct. So 1835, and we can all think we don't know very much maybe about this culture, but what does it mean to lose someone and still to feel I am alive today and have to live in this moment right now?
I think it means, that word that she said, for her, it means duty. It means the connection she has to other people. Those 4 lines that you just called attention to almost paraphrase a lot of her letters. So she feels burdened by the challenges of the life that she lives in every day. Her husband is so often off traveling. Well, at least we have letters she wrote to her husband when he is traveling. We don't know what's going on between them when he's not traveling. So in the letter, she's often feeling lonely because he's gone and not there to help with her. And she's usually sick. She was really sickly, and she's got her other children to raise. Well, maybe we'll get to them, but she's got her other children to raise, and so she feels that responsibility, and she represents the family in a sense, because this is the family that's indirectly a kind of royalty of where they live. At this point, they're living in Mackinac Island, but that's kind of like the capital of the Michigan Territory. That's where the official, the agent Henry lives and has his office, and he's off, signing treaties and working in the legislature and consulting with the president, or trying to sometimes, and sometimes actually consulting with Andrew Jackson, which is a little a story in itself, that he goes to Jackson and he brings Andrew Jackson, who is busy forcing Native peoples out of their lands. He brings Andrew Jackson gifts from Jane Schoolcraft, the maple syrup that she's prepared for him in the mokuks, the birch bark containers that she makes for him, and the idea of Andrew Jackson, sort of sucking on the molasses. That in effect, he get the maple syrup, not molasses, that he gets from Jane Schoolcraft, that there is this kind of connection. She was actually bizarrely connected in a lot of different ways to the iconic representatives of canonical American culture. So she was both off on what white people saw as the frontier and in a capital of Ojibwe culture, and still connected to the canonical centers of US culture. But in any case, she felt the burden of that. And so she felt she couldn't just give up and drop everything, although she feared that she might die at any moment. And she did die eventually in 1842, without any real shift in her health, that she was always bad, but there was no trigger that said now she's about to die. And so it was a surprise. And she lived many decades, several decades, let's say, expecting that might come at any moment. Also, she's probably at this point addicted to laudanum. And the fate of she's not the only romantic writer to get addicted to laudanum, and not the only 19th century writer to get addicted to laudanum. And it's probably partly a way of the medical establishment condescending to women, not that different from the opioid crisis today. And they think they can help, and they end up making things worse. Wow. And so that probably contributed to her suffering. Probably in the mid-1830s, she started to get addicted. So it's not totally clear that would have begun by this point.
I want to ask you, sort of in conclusion, about your understanding of poetry and the role of poetry. So as you just said, she's not a footnote to anything or anybody, and she is in the tradition of sort of American writers, from Anne Bradstreet to Dickinson to sort of our contemporary poets. She is still usually identified as a woman poet, which is the fate of women poets, whereas male poets are not. But what about poetry? Why does someone, this is a very big question, and kind of, but I'm really interested, as you are, in literature as a form of self-expression, as a deliberate use of language to give voice to your own state of mind and your situation on your own terms, to not document something for somebody else, to not write a social commentary, to not make an argument, but to express one's own state of existence quite accurately. And what I found, which is really interesting, a lot of anthologies of literature, when they get to Native American poetry, they start printing political speeches and statements and treaties and negotiations, and suddenly they have to do the work of sociology or politics, as if there's no room for anybody to express himself. So literature has its very particular status. And if you think about her, he's saying she has a very full life. She's in a very public place. She's a mother. She's running a household. She's her own mother and her own father have these big roles. Her husband has a huge role. And then she sits down and writes poems. What do you think what is that about?
It can be about a lot of different things. Sometimes it's just a moment of almost like a twitch of pleasure. So she can stick a poem in a letter to her husband when he's traveling, a poem, just 2 lines. So I'll read it. It goes like this. My earrings are gone. in the wars of fate, and a pair of red drops I would not hate. It's her way of asking her to bring something back for him. Or it can be a moment of terrible pathos, like the moments that you just called attention to after her son dies. So I think that poetry is the full range of emotions that populate our lives are susceptible to poetry, and that it's a place where we go to reckon with what our emotions actually are and find that cauldron that merges emotion with language. And I think that it's not only, it's always already that deep personal expression, and it's always already social at the same time. None of us makes up the language that we write in or think in, but we all play variations on it and repeat variations that we receive and combine those together. And the different ways that somebody else, or in our best moments, we combine them together, offer now and then those moments that we exalt into something worth remembering, something worth returning to, that we then see as not only definitional of an emotion, but also a way of sustaining that emotion after we may have lost it, so that we can always go back to it, even when at the same time it's not there. And we have both at once. Then it's there and it's not there. And maybe that's what poetry is.
I like this a lot, Bob, and the title of your anthology is called Changing is Not Vanishing, but you said to go back to a state that has not disappeared. There's a vibrant tradition and culture now of Native American writers, of course, but to go back to Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, to say we can go back to a state and actually stay there with her for a moment, rather than to just say this is what happened, who she was, and now she's forgotten. What are you working on now for, because you've really changed the landscape of American literature, which is fantastic. And you say somewhere in one of your books that at some point you realize that editing things may be the lasting contribution. Well, many of us write very smart books, but I think editing, actually the work of editing and translation, which I do a lot of translating, is a different kind of service, and it allows others to speak again, like all these poets.
Yeah, there's a certain excitement, personal excitement that critics get in doing their own particular criticism about literature that's already that people already know, and that's great. And it has a half-life and a shelf life, and maybe people forget some of it too quickly, but it does have a shelf life. But if you can get literature that people didn't know was there and bring it into the shelf that stays there, then that has I think finally a more lasting contribution, which is against what we've been trained to think of as where we most contribute. What am I working on now, though? I'm writing a book about extreme poverty in the literature of the Great Depression.
Wow. Sadly enough, also a topic that doesn't go away in America.
It's too much with us now, isn't it?
Yeah. That's right. So I really want to thank you. I want to just, for our listeners, the name of the edited book is called The Sound the Stars Make, Rushing Through the Sky, the writings of Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, where he edited her poetry. And then the other book that I also refer to is Changing is Not Vanishing, a collection of American Indian poetry to 1930. I read both of those books are inspirations and calls to actions for others and more people to do the work you've done, to actually recover these poets for us.
Thank you. I hope so. I hope so. It's about a collective process that many of us can engage in together.
So I really want to thank you. You are on Twitter, of course, Robert Dale Parker without the E, and Robert, that's R-O-B-R-T, Dale Parker. And we will share this episode, and let's hope for our listeners, they're going to now discover a whole tradition. Many of them will know that, but there are many others, I'm sure, for whom this will be really new. So I want to thank you for joining the podcast today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Howard.
And let's hope at some point after this we can meet in person after this whole pandemic situation is over. And I want to ask you finally, I already asked you last question. We have a holiday coming up in 14 states in America. It's Indigenous. I read this actually in somewhere, Indigenous People Day versus Thanksgiving. How do you actually acknowledge this day on Thursday?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. It's also always a time of papers to read and so on.
Yeah.
But it's great to take a break and just connect, even if it's over Zoom, to those who you're closest to, even if you're far from them. And so nothing special and distinctive in my way of doing it. But I do feel there's something special in knowing that as you do that, so are millions of other people doing that at the same time.
Right. So I wish you a good and safe holiday, and then
And to you.
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for being with me. Think about it. Deep conversations with Willy Baer on big ideas and great books.